There's a lot moving. You have got the anti-Israel, pro-Hamas forces taking over Trump Tower in New York. They want the release of Mahmoud Khalil. They're not getting that. Now, these may be American citizens. They just go to jail. Mahmoud Khalil is going back home. This is not a free speech conversation, as William Jacobson, Cornell law professor, explained. And then you have the possibility of a deal where you now see Vladimir Putin saying, well, we'll take a look at a 30-day ceasefire, but we've got a lot of questions. Tony Katz today. Good to be with you. Ed Morrissey joins me from hotair.com. He was kind enough to stick around through the break as he joined us a little early on the live stream to talk about this. Let's start with what we're seeing from Vladimir Putin. This is the late breaking news. This is one of the stories there from Red State, a partner of yours over at Hot Air. Vladimir Putin agrees in principle to Russian ceasefire with Ukraine. Of course, you have been writing about this as well. Talk to me about what the opportunity is here and where we think the politics leads this.
Well, first off, I think it might be overstating it just a little bit to say that he agreed to a ceasefire in principle. I think he's agreed to talk about a ceasefire.
Solid.
Based on what the principles might be. And I think he's being very cagey about this. He wants the Ukrainians to withdraw from Kursk before he enters into that conversation. But this is the first time that he's actually even indicated that he's willing to have a conversation about how this war ends, which is an improvement. It may not necessarily be the path to the end, but it is at least moving the ball down that direction finally after 3 years of war and no negotiations whatsoever. And of course, this is predicated on the fact that Trump got Zelensky to finally agree to have talks as well, because Zelensky didn't want to do that. He says, you can't trust Putin. I guess we're going to find that out. I don't necessarily think that you can trust Putin either. I don't know what his game is here. I doubt very seriously that he's going to just stop on a dime. And I think part of what he wants here is a return to the status quo ante of not just 2021 in regards to positioning of troops in Eastern Europe, but maybe all the way back to 1999. And he's certainly not going to get that. NATO is not going to agree to withdraw from Poland to Romania. That was part of the thing that Putin was saying that he wanted in 2022. Putin has to come up with some concessions from NATO that will make this 3-year disaster look like it was worthwhile.
And we're clear that this has been an equal disaster for Vladimir Putin, an invasion that was supposed to take 3 days. Everybody and their mother said this would take 3 days, and the Ukrainians were able to show the world that these Russians don't know how to fight. They do not have a standing army that is of value, but they can throw bodies at a problem until quite literally there are no more bodies, and they have got more bodies than you have. So, as you write in your piece, in quoting the New York Times, it's not a yes, but it's certainly not a no. So as you have been researching this, Ed Morrissey, what do you think gets Vladimir Putin to yes? Land? A NATO agreement? Which one do you think moves most?
Well, I think land is almost a foregone conclusion at this point. He went into Ukraine after spending several years since 2014 talking about how the ethnic Russians were being politically oppressed in Ukraine. The Donbass is an ethnic Russian enclave. They would probably choose to be part of Russia, and their politics has always been Moscow centered ever since the Ukraine broke out of the USSR in 1991. And that's been an ongoing political struggle in Ukraine for the last 30-something years. So I don't necessarily think that losing that, other than obviously the resources and some of the natural defenses there, which are certainly part of that equation, is politically going to be all that harmful to the ethnic Ukrainians who really would like Ukraine for Ukrainians. That aside, it's going to be tough for Zelensky to bargain away land that they lost in successive invasions in 2014 and again in 2022. Politically speaking, it's probably not going to go over very well. On the other hand, maybe it won't be as bad as it would seem at first, because again, maybe the ethnic Ukrainians are at a stage where they would just rather be rid of the ethnic Russians and live with that outcome rather than keep getting bombed. And I think that so the lands, the territorial concessions, I think, are a baseline here. I think the real question is, what kind of security guarantees will Vladimir Putin accept that will protect what's left of Ukraine from more Russian aggression? And how does NATO figure into that? Because don't forget, Finland and Sweden joined NATO as a result of the invasion, and now you've got an 850-mile frontier. Russia does 850-mile frontier with NATO, which goes right up, almost right next to the Murmansk naval base, which is one of their big strategic naval bases, and they're not happy about that. And will Putin insist that Finland and Sweden go back to neutrality? I don't think that they're going to do that.
I would argue and agree that he can't move Finland and Sweden to do that. They simply will look at him and go, "Niet." They're not going to be a part of that argument. Talking to Ed Morrissey of hotair.com. But the NATO concession always started with Ukraine not being a NATO nation. I certainly support Ukraine not being a NATO nation. Can Ukraine see its way clear to a deal by not being a NATO nation?
Well, I mean, they're not going to be a NATO nation. They're just not going to be a NATO nation. Even Joe Biden was kind of wishy-washy on that. And Donald Trump has been insistent that he doesn't want to provoke the Russians by doing that. And that he thought that the NATO talk previously was part of what led up to what happened in 2014. And again, what happened in 2022. Donald Trump, at least as long as Donald Trump is president, Ukraine is not going to join NATO because the U.S. will just keep vetoing it. The question here is, what other security guarantees can you do that aren't provocative? And that was what the mineral rights deal was about, was to show that the U.S. was investing in Ukraine, in a sovereign Ukraine, in a very real way, and to make sure that Putin got that signal, but in a non-provocative way, not one that was going to rub his nose in it. And I think that may be as much as Ukraine's going to get. France has talked about sending some troops on their own, but not as part of NATO. And I think Putin, I think a few days ago, if I recall, had said something about wanting to discuss what the composition of peacekeeping forces would look like in Ukraine. So I think he's already conceded that there's going to have to be some peacekeeping forces on the frontier, which is good. And I think makes some sense. But if it's a NATO deployment, I think he absolutely says no to that. I think it's going to have to be individual countries acting on their own that don't necessarily involve an Article 5 declaration if hostilities erupt on that frontier again.
Article 5 being an attack on one is an attack on all. Talking to Ed Morrissey of hotair.com, we saw from Mark Thiessen that the Treasury Department under Trump just changed some sanctions rules that would have prevented Europeans from being able to give money to the Russians for energy. It would no longer allow for that transfer, thus cutting off Russia's ability to get paid. Was this the move? Was this the leverage, the Reagan on Gorbachev oil price leverage maneuver that brought Putin to this moment?
Well,
or really ask it this way. Does Putin need this ceasefire as much as Ukraine?
I think Putin needs a ceasefire. I'm not sure if it's as much as Ukraine, but Putin really needs a ceasefire. And I think Politico Europe had a piece, and this is about 2 weeks ago, about the fact that they've extended their debt as far as it can go. They can't get more credit. And Donald Trump said something, I think yesterday, that he could make things very difficult on Russia financially if they didn't start talking peace. And I've been watching this thing about the energy payments kind of unfolding. And Jackie Heinrich over at Fox News was saying that she'd asked about the fact that the waivers had apparently expired and nobody's done anything about it. And the White House was going, "Oh yeah, we may have overlooked that. Let us look into that." But she hasn't heard back in 2 days. So my guess is that this was a low-level, a signal that didn't go out publicly, but would be understood privately, which is, I think, how Donald Trump wants to deal with Putin. I think he understands, or at least this is his approach. I'll just say this. I think his approach with Putin is don't rub his face in it, and you can get him to come along. Now, whether or not that's the case, we'll see. But that's one of the reasons why he's been trying to talk in a more balanced manner than Biden did about Putin. Why he's scolded Zelensky for, not being open to the idea of peace. Not because he's aligning himself with Putin, but because he wants to bring Putin to the table. And I think that some of these things are happening sotto voce so that Putin doesn't feel like he's being humiliated as part of this process. Now, that may not seem like justice to a lot of people, but if it gets you an enduring peace, I think we can live with a few days of Putin not getting, humiliated.
Talking to Ed Morrissey of higher.com, I will say that I would object to the idea that Russia has run out of credit. If the plan all along, if the ultimate reality is Russia as a failed nation economically, being a vassal state of China, China can put as much money in as they want to be able to create disruptions in other places. And I don't want to leave that equation off the table, but allow me to change gears on you just for a moment. As we take a look at what is happening, is the New York Post with the headline that it's a tower takeover. You had let me see if I can grab this here. You had they're not pro Israel. They're anti-Israel. They're really pro-Hamas. And what you had are these people who are desperate to see Mahmoud Khalil out of jail. And because this guy is connected to terrorist organizations, supportive, I should say, of terrorist organizations. He's a permanent lawful resident. But as Marco Rubio, the Secretary of State, explained, that doesn't mean that you have the same rights as an American citizen. Now you have these people so believing that this is a First Amendment issue, a free speech issue, that they have taken over Trump Tower. Tower takeover is how the New York Post put it. There's a difference between speech and act, correct?
Yes. Jonathan Turley was making the same point on Fox and Friends this morning, is that the issue for Khalil isn't speech, it's conduct. This is conduct. It's not speech. And we used to understand the difference between the two, right, Tony? I mean, it used to be speech is speech, but if you start occupying spaces, that's conduct. And that is arrestable and prosecutable. So bad behavior is not free speech. Free speech is free speech. If all Khalil did was have a legal demonstration where he was espousing the side of the Palestinians, nobody would be talking about this because it wouldn't be news and nobody would have been intimidated. Khalil was taking part of occupations of buildings at Columbia, disseminating Hamas propaganda, some of which was from the Hamas media group, labeled as such, and organizing intimidation campaigns at Columbia University. That's conduct. That's not speech. And the Secretary of State has practically plenary power to revoke green card or student or visa statuses and expel people from the United States on the basis of national security. And Hamas is a listed terrorist organization. The State Department has been since 1997. So if you're espousing Hamas and you are disseminating Hamas propaganda as part of an intimidation campaign against Jews, both students and faculty, that's deportable conduct. The Secretary of State can determine that you are detrimental to national security because of that and boot you out of the country. And you don't have to have a trial for that. That's part of the authority that the Secretary of State has.
Yeah,
however,
not everybody and their mother, including Bernie Sanders and a host of others, saying there's a little thing called free speech, a little thing called the First Amendment. How come you don't know it, Donald Trump? In every single situation, the left is taking the wrong side. I think the argument is in an 80-20 argument, right? 80% of the people believe something. The political left has been on the 20% side of everything.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is a great example of that, right? People don't like radicals occupying campus buildings. They just don't. Even if they like even if they're maybe sympathetic to some of the messaging, they don't like that there are intimidation campaigns going on college campuses. It's one of the reasons why Democrats lost the election last time around, is because they were pandering to the 20% of people who think that that's a great idea. And we went through this in the 60s and the 70s, right? And eventually people settled back on the idea that there's a difference between speech and conduct. This is not speech. This is conduct. He's not being expelled because he is sympathetic to the Palestinians. He's being expelled because he's coordinating Hamas propaganda materials and coordinating illegal activities on college campuses. And he's not a citizen. By the way, citizens could have been prosecuted for some of this. He could be prosecuted. It's just easier to kick him out of the country. The Holy Land Foundation case is a great example of that, which also involved Hamas propaganda as well as financing.
You can get more on that at hotair.com. Stay right there. Ed Morrissey, hotair.com. I appreciate you being here. More is coming up. I'm Tony Katz. This is Tony Katz Today.